A cigarette butt sits in a police evidence room for 40 years, and nobody knows it's going to solve one of Vermont's most horrific murders. Nobody knows that this single piece of physical evidence, this lark cigarette carelessly left next to a dead woman's body, is going to unravel a mystery that stumped investigators for over half a century. A mystery that involves a brutal killer who fled to Thailand to become a Buddhist monk, a newlywed wife who lied to protect her husband, and a family that watched their parents die without ever knowing who murdered their daughter on a summer night in 1971, when the world was different and DNA was something people studied in biology class but never imagined could catch a killer. And this case, this absolutely devastating case, shows you everything that's both beautiful and terrible about cold case investigations, because sometimes justice takes 52 years and sometimes the killer is already dead when you finally figure out who he was, and sometimes a cigarette butt is the only thing standing between a family and the truth about what happened to someone they loved. July 20th, 1971, Burlington, Vermont. And Rita Curran is 24 years old, which doesn't sound young now, but back then that was a full adult, a woman with a career as a second-grade teacher at Milton Elementary School, a woman who sang in barbershop quartets because she had this beautiful voice that people remembered decades later, a woman who just moved out of her parents' home for the first time in her life, and was living with 3 roommates she didn't know very well in an apartment on Brooks Avenue in Burlington's Old North End. And Rita's whole life is ahead of her. She's taking graduate courses at the University of Vermont. She's working as a maid at a local motel during the summer months to make extra money, and she's got this sweet, shy personality where she still spends most of her free time with her family back in Milton, about 25 minutes away, because even though she wanted independence, she's still that good Catholic girl from an Irish Newfoundland family who sings in the church choir and makes her parents proud. That night, Rita had barbershop quartet practice, and she came home afterward, put her hair up in curlers, changed into her pajamas and housecoat, and got ready for bed like she did every night. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would make you think this ordinary Tuesday evening in July was going to be the last night of her life. And her roommates, these 3 women she shared the apartment with, they decided to go out for late-night dinner and drinks. And Rita stayed home because she had work the next day, or maybe she was just tired, or maybe she just wasn't that close with these roommates yet, since she'd only been living there a couple weeks. And this decision, this completely normal decision to stay home while your roommates go out, this is the decision that cost Rita Curran her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Somewhere around midnight, maybe a little before, maybe a little after, Rita Curran is attacked in her apartment, and what happens to her is so violent, so brutal, that the detectives who responded to the scene never forgot it. And we're talking about experienced investigators who'd seen plenty of terrible things, and Patrick Leahy, who was the state's attorney for Chittenden County at the time, and later became one of the longest-serving U.S. senators in American history. He said decades later that Rita Curran's family stayed in his thoughts for years after their daughter's murder, because the case was just that haunting. The initial police report describes a vicious struggle, describes how Rita fought for her life with everything she had, describes injuries and evidence of sexual assault, and ultimately describes a young woman who was beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death in her own bedroom while her roommates were out having drinks and while a city of 40,000 people slept, completely unaware that something monstrous was happening on Brooks Avenue. One of Rita's roommates comes home in the early morning hours of July 20th and finds Rita's body, and that discovery, that moment of walking into your apartment and finding your roommate dead, that's when everything changes. That's when Burlington Police Department mobilizes. That's when detectives cancel their vacations. That's when the medical examiner and the district attorney show up in the middle of the night. That's when 9 different officials crowd into this apartment building trying to process a crime scene that's going to haunt them for the rest of their careers. The initial investigation is massive by 1971 standards. They interview over 100 people. They give polygraph tests to more than a dozen suspects. They document everything meticulously because even though they don't have DNA technology yet, even though genetic genealogy won't be invented for another 40-some years, these detectives understand that someday, somehow, science might catch up to this case, and they want to make sure every piece of evidence is preserved. Every witness statement is documented. Every cigarette butt and piece of fabric is carefully stored away. And thank God they did this, because without that methodical 1971 police work, there's no way this case gets solved in 2023. The building where Rita lived was one of those old multi-unit apartment buildings that you see all over Burlington's old North End. The kind where people can hear their neighbors through the walls and ceilings, where everyone knows everyone else's business, where a violent struggle in the middle of the night should have woken somebody up, should have caused someone to call the police. But apparently nobody heard anything, or nobody wanted to get involved, or nobody wanted to admit they heard something. And this becomes one of the puzzling aspects of the case, because how do you beat and strangle someone to death in an apartment building and nobody hears anything? On the morning of July 20th, just hours after Rita's body is discovered, Burlington police officer Richard Garrow goes upstairs to the 3rd floor, 2 floors above Rita's apartment, and knocks on the door of apartment residents William and Michelle DeRoos. And this is where the story gets interesting, because William DeRoos is 31 years old, and he's lived in Burlington for a while, and he's got a past. He's got a criminal record, and he's just married Michelle, who's only 23 years old, around Rita's age, and they've been married for exactly 2 weeks, exactly 14 days, and Michelle answers the door and tells Officer Garrow that yes, they were home all night. No, they didn't hear anything unusual. No, they don't know anything about what happened downstairs. Throughout that first day of investigation, 3 different law enforcement officers speak with the DeRoos couple. And every single time Michelle provides the same story, her husband was with her all night. They were together in their apartment. They heard nothing, saw nothing, know nothing, and this alibi, this simple alibi from a wife to her husband, this is what protects William DeRoos for the next 51 years, because without any physical evidence connecting him to the crime, without any witnesses placing him at the scene, without anything except proximity and timing, the police have nothing to go on, and William DeRoos becomes just another person who lived in the building, just another neighbor who was interviewed and cleared and moved on with his life, except William DeRoos didn't just move on with his life in any normal way. Within weeks of Rita Curran's murder, William DeRoos leaves Burlington, leaves his brand new wife, leaves Vermont entirely, and he doesn't just move to another state. He doesn't just move to another part of the country. He goes all the way to Thailand, and he becomes a Buddhist monk. And now you might be thinking, okay, that's weird, but maybe he always planned to do that. Maybe he was on some spiritual journey. Maybe this was a coincidence. But here's the thing about William DeRoos. Here's what makes this story so darkly fascinating. He wasn't some peaceful spiritual seeker. He wasn't some gentle soul looking for enlightenment. He was a man with violence in his blood and a trail of victims who would later tell police about his sudden, unprovoked outbursts of rage. Michelle eventually follows him to Thailand in March of 1972, and by the time she gets there, DeRoos has already disrobed, already left the monastery. And they travel together for a few weeks before he rejoins the monastery and she becomes a nun. And this isn't a Hollywood movie. This isn't some beautiful story of spiritual redemption. This is a murderer hiding in a monastery. This is a man using Buddhism as a shield, using religion as camouflage, using the world's oldest spiritual traditions to escape justice for one of Vermont's most brutal crimes. The investigation back in Burlington continues without DeRoos. continues with dozens of other suspects, continues with theories and tips and dead ends. And one of the suspects they seriously consider is Ted Bundy. Yes, that Ted Bundy, the serial killer who murdered at least 30 young women across the country. Because it turns out that Rita worked as a summer maid at a motel that was right next to the Elizabeth Lund home for unwed mothers, which was Bundy's birthplace, and there were similarities between Rita's murder and known Bundy crime scenes. And retired FBI agent John Bassett actually proposed Bundy as a suspect. And Rita's sister Mary even wrote to Bundy while he was on Florida's death row to ask if he killed her sister. And the FBI told Mary that Bundy declined to confirm or deny his involvement, which is just about the most chilling non-answer you can imagine. Burlington Municipal Records note that someone named Bundy was bitten by a dog in Burlington that week in July 1971, and Detective Robert Keppel questioned Bundy, who said he murdered a young woman in Burlington when he was there in 1971 to get information about his birth. But then, on January 22, 1989, the eve of his execution, Bundy denied to FBI Special Agent William Hagmaier any involvement in Rita's case. And so, the Bundy theory dies with Bundy, but the case continues. Continues through the 1970s, continues through the 1980s, continues into the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s, continues while Rita's parents grow old, waiting for answers that never come, continues while her brother Thomas and sister Mary try to move on with their lives but can't. Because how do you move on when your sister was murdered and nobody knows who did it? How do you go to family gatherings and see the empty chair where Rita should be sitting? How do you watch your parents die without ever getting justice for their daughter? Meanwhile, William DeRoos emerges from Thailand in 1974 and surfaces in San Francisco, where he's going by the name Dutch and presenting himself as some kind of guru, and he marries another woman named Sarah Hepting, who later tells police that DeRoos was violent, that he had these sudden outbursts, and here's where it gets really disturbing. Hepting tells investigators that one time DeRoos stabbed one of her female friends with a knife, just stabbed her completely without provocation, and when Hepting asked him why he did it, DeRoos replied, "I thought I was stabbing you." And think about that for a second. Think about what kind of person stabs someone and then says, they meant to stab someone else, like that makes it better. Think about what kind of mind works that way. And then there's another incident where DeRoos attacked Hepting herself, strangled her until she lost consciousness, strangled her the same way he strangled Rita Curran. And this man, this violent, dangerous man, is just walking around San Francisco in the mid-1970s and nobody connects him to Rita's murder because he's on the other side of the country and Burlington police don't know where he is and the technology doesn't exist. Yet to tie him to the crime scene in any definitive way. August 7th, 1986. William DeRoos dies of acute morphine poisoning in a San Francisco hotel room, and you can call it an overdose, or you can call it karma, or you can call it whatever you want, but the fact is that DeRoos dies 15 years after, murdering Rita Curran, and he dies without ever being charged, without ever being arrested, without ever facing a single consequence for what he did on Brooks Avenue that night in July 1971. And for the next 37 years, from 1986 to 2023, William DeRoos's name is just another name in Rita Curran's case file, just another person who was interviewed and cleared and moved away. Just another dead end in a case that seems like it's never going to be solved. But here's the thing about cold cases. Here's what makes them both heartbreaking and hopeful. Evidence doesn't age the same way people do, and that cigarette butt, that Lark cigarette that some detective carefully bagged and tagged in 1971 without knowing what DNA was, or how it worked, or why it mattered. That cigarette butt just sits in the Burlington Police Department evidence room, waiting for science to catch up, waiting for technology to evolve, waiting for someone to realize that the answer to who killed Rita Curran has been sitting in a storage box for 4 decades. The breakthrough doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen because of some dramatic new tip or deathbed confession. It happens because of methodical, painstaking police work combined with revolutionary advances in genetic genealogy. And the story of how this case gets solved is almost as fascinating as the crime itself, because it shows you how modern cold case investigations actually work when you've got dedicated detectives, cutting-edge technology, and a police department that refuses to give up. 2014, and Burlington police finally send the cigarette butt for DNA analysis. Finally used technology that's been around for years, but that costs money and requires resources and needs to be prioritized against current cases. And they extract a DNA profile. They get a genetic fingerprint from whoever smoked that cigarette 50-some years ago. But when they run it through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that's supposed to match DNA from crime scenes to DNA from known offenders, they get nothing. Absolutely nothing. No matches, no hits, no leads. And this happens all the time in cold cases because CODIS only works if your suspect has been arrested and had their DNA taken and entered into the system. And if William DeRoos died in 1986, before DNA databases became standard practice, before police routinely collected genetic material from offenders, then his DNA isn't in CODIS, and that cigarette butt becomes just another piece of evidence that confirms someone was at the scene but doesn't tell you who. Now, fast forward to 2019 and Detective Lieutenant Jim Trebe at the Burlington Police Department makes a decision that changes everything. He decides to reopen Rita Curran's case, but he's not going to do it the traditional way. He's not going to assign one detective to work it alone on the side while they handle active cases. He's going to treat this 50-year-old murder like it just happened yesterday. He's going to assemble an entire team of detectives and crime scene technicians and specialists, and they're going to review every single piece of evidence, every single witness statement, every single photograph and document and item that was collected in 1971. And this team approach, this idea of throwing multiple sets of eyes and multiple areas of expertise at a cold case, this is what modern cold case investigation looks like when it's done right. Trebe and his team start retesting evidence, start looking at things with fresh eyes and new technology, and they make a crucial decision to send that cigarette butt DNA to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy. And if you don't know what genetic genealogy is, it's basically the same technology that people use when they send their DNA to Ancestry or 23andMe to find out where their great-great-grandparents came from. Except instead of finding your third cousins, you're using it to find murderers and rapists and criminals who left their DNA at crime scenes decades ago. C.C. Moore is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, and she's basically the queen of this field. She solved dozens of cold cases using genetic genealogy, and when Burlington police send her the DNA profile from the cigarette butt, she uploads it to public DNA databases where people have voluntarily submitted their genetic information, hoping to learn about their ancestry. And the system starts looking for matches, looking for relatives, looking for anyone who shares enough DNA with the cigarette smoker to indicate a family connection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, and here's where it gets wild. Genetic genealogy doesn't need an exact match. Doesn't need the actual suspect's DNA in the database. It just needs relatives, second cousins, third cousins, even fourth cousins once removed, because once you identify people who share DNA with your unknown suspect, you can start building family trees. You can start working backward through genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, census data, all the paper trails that people leave behind as they live their lives. And you can use those family trees to narrow down the possibilities, to eliminate branches, to focus on individuals who were the right age, lived in the right place, had the right background to be your suspect. Moore uploads the DNA profile, and within just a few hours after 50 years of this case being unsolved, she identifies genetic matches on both the paternal and maternal sides that all point to one family, one surname, one set of relatives, and she starts building the family tree and the name that keeps appearing. The name that connects all these genetic breadcrumbs is DeRoos, William DeRoos. And suddenly, this guy who was interviewed in 1971 and cleared because his wife gave him an alibi, this guy who moved to Thailand and became a monk and died in San Francisco in 1986, suddenly, he's back in the spotlight after 37 years of being dead and forgotten. Cece Moore tells the Burlington detectives that she's certain, absolutely certain based on the genetic genealogy, that William DeRoos smoked that cigarette. And the detectives are probably thinking, okay, but how certain is certain? How do we know this isn't some distant relative with a similar genetic profile? How do we confirm this beyond any doubt? And that's where good old-fashioned detective work comes in, because Moore tells them that DeRoos has a half-brother who's still alive, a man named Douglas McGinty, and if you can get a DNA sample from McGinty, you can definitively confirm whether the cigarette DNA belongs to someone in the DeRoos family. The detectives reach out to Douglas McGinty and explain the situation. Explain that his half-brother might be connected to an old murder case. And here's something beautiful about human nature. McGinty doesn't refuse, doesn't lawyer up, doesn't say this is my family and I'm not helping you investigate my dead half-brother. He voluntarily provides a DNA sample because he wants to know the truth, because he understands that if his half-brother killed someone, that victim's family deserves answers. And when the lab compares McGinty's DNA to the cigarette DNA, it confirms what Cece Moore already knew. The cigarette was definitely smoked by someone from the DeRoos family, and given the age, the location, the timing, the only person who makes sense is William DeRoos. But the Burlington police don't stop there, because DNA alone isn't the whole story. They need to build a complete case. They need to understand motive and opportunity and means. They need to retest other evidence from the scene and remember Rita's housecoat, the one she was wearing when she was attacked, the one that was ripped during the struggle. That housecoat has been sitting in evidence for 50 years, too. And when they test it with modern DNA technology, they find DNA on the fabric. And the DNA matches the cigarette DNA, matches William DeRoos. And now you've got DNA in 2 different locations at the crime scene. Now you've got physical evidence that places DeRoos not just in the apartment, but in direct contact with Rita during the attack. And this is when the case transforms from a cold case mystery into a solvable murder with a clear suspect. September 2022. And Detective Thomas Chenette tracks down Michelle DeRoos, except she's not Michelle DeRoos anymore. She's changed her name to Kailas Nagarjuna. She's moved to Eugene, Oregon, and she's been living her life for 51 years with this secret. This lie she told the police in July 1971, and Chenette sits down with her and explains what they found, explains about the DNA evidence, explains that they know William was in Rita's apartment that night. And Kailas, who's now 74 years old, who's been carrying this burden for over half a century, finally tells the truth. She admits she lied, admits that William wasn't with her all night like she told the police back in 1971, admits that they had a fight that evening, admits that William left the apartment to take a walk to cool down, admits that he came back later after she'd gone to bed, admits that the next morning when the police knocked on their door asking about the murder downstairs, William told her to lie, told her to say he was with her all night, told her that he had a criminal record and the police would make him a suspect even though he didn't do anything. And she believed him because she was 23 years old and had been married for 2 weeks and was in love and naive and didn't want to think that her husband could do something so horrible. Detective Chenette says he doesn't believe Kailas knew that William killed Rita. doesn't believe she was covering up a murder, believes she was just a young woman who trusted her husband and did what he asked her to do, and then spent the rest of her life not wanting to confront what that lie might have meant. And the Burlington police decide not to charge her with obstruction or filing a false report or any of the other crimes she technically committed back in 1971. Because what's the point? She's an old woman now. She's cooperating fully. She's providing crucial information that helps close the case. And charging her doesn't bring Rita back, doesn't undo the 50 years of her family's suffering, doesn't serve any purpose except revenge. Now the detectives have DNA evidence. They have a confession from DeRousse's ex-wife that he lied about his alibi. They have a timeline that makes sense, and they start looking deeper into William DeRousse's background, start trying to understand who this man was, what made him tick, whether Rita was his only victim, and what they find is absolutely chilling, because William DeRousse wasn't just a guy who made one terrible mistake one time. He was a violent predator with a pattern of hurting women. The detectives interview Sarah Hepting, DeRousse's second wife from San Francisco, and she tells them stories that make your skin crawl. Tells them about the time DeRousse stabbed her female friend with a pocket knife completely without provocation. Just pulled out a knife and stabbed this woman in the abdomen while they were having a conversation. And when Sarah asked him why he did it, his response was, "I thought I was stabbing you." Like he just got confused about which woman he was supposed to be stabbing. Like violence against women was so natural to him that he didn't even need a reason, just picked a target and attacked. Sarah also tells them about the time DeRousse strangled her, put his hands around her throat and choked her until she lost consciousness. The exact same method he used to kill Rita Curran. And she tells them that he was unpredictable, that he could be fine one minute and violent the next, that living with him was like living with a bomb that could go off at any moment. And eventually she left him because she valued her life more than her marriage. Left him before he could kill her the way he killed Rita. The pattern is clear. William DeRousse was a man who hurt women, who attacked women, who strangled women. And the fact that he only has one confirmed murder probably says more about luck than about restraint. Probably means that Rita was the one who fought back hard enough, or screamed loud enough, or struggled fiercely enough that he had to kill her to keep her quiet, while other women like Sarah escaped with their lives but carried the trauma forever. February 2023. And the Burlington police are ready to go public with their findings, ready to tell Rita's family after 52 years that they finally know who killed their sister, their daughter, their loved one. And this is a moment that the Curran family thought would never come, because when you wait 5 decades for answers, when you watch your parents die without ever getting justice, when you see other cold cases get solved while yours stays cold, you start to lose hope. You start to think that maybe some questions just don't have answers, that maybe some murders just never get solved. The police arrange a private meeting with Rita's brother Thomas and her sister Mary, and they sit them down and walk them through everything, show them the evidence, explain the genetic genealogy, introduce them to Cece Moore via video call, tell them about William DeRousse and his violent history and his flight to Thailand and his death in 1986. And for the first time in 52 years, Thomas and Mary can ask questions and get real answers, can understand what happened that night in July 1971, can know who took their sister from them and why and how. Mary Campbell, Rita's sister, later says that the Burlington police showed her family kindness and consideration and caring and compassion over decades, over multiple police chiefs and multiple administrations and multiple officers. And that kind of continuity, that kind of institutional commitment to a case, that's rare and special, and it's why this case ultimately got solved when so many others stay cold. Thomas Curran says he doesn't think about the guy who did this to Rita as much as he thinks about Rita herself and about their parents and what they went through. Says he prays to his parents and prays to Rita, and you can hear in his voice that this isn't really closure, because closure suggests that something is finished and done and you can move on. But losing your sister to murder is never finished. Never done, never something you move on from. The best you can hope for is answers and maybe a little bit of peace. February 21st, 2023. The Burlington Police Department holds a press conference, and Acting Police Chief John Murad stands in front of cameras and reporters and announces that Vermont's oldest cold case has been solved. Announces that they know who killed Rita Curran. Announces that the killer was William DeRoos, who lived 2 floors above Rita and who died in 1986. And this press conference is emotional and powerful and represents 5 decades of work by multiple generations of detectives. And Murad makes a point that's crucial to understanding how this case got solved. He says that what the current detectives accomplished was only possible because of the incredibly thorough initial response back in 1971. Because those detectives in the early 70s documented everything, preserved everything, collected that cigarette butt even though they had no idea what DNA was or how it would work, and without that 1971 groundwork, without that meticulous evidence collection, the 2023 technology would have had nothing to work with. The press conference includes video testimony from Cece Moore, who explains how genetic genealogy works, explains how she was able to narrow down the suspect pool to just 1 person within hours, explains that this case is a fantastic illustration of the power of investigative genetic genealogy. And Moore's testimony is important because genetic genealogy is still relatively new and controversial. Some people worry about privacy implications. Worry about the fact that you can be identified through your relative's DNA, even if you never submitted your own DNA to any database. Worry about where this technology might lead. But cases like Rita Curran's show the incredible good that genetic genealogy can do. Show how it can bring closure to families who've waited decades for answers. Show how it can identify violent predators who thought they got away with murder. At the press conference, Rita's siblings speak, and they're gracious and grateful and heartbroken all at once. Mary thanks the police department for never giving up. Thomas talks about how his children and grandchildren never knew Rita, but now at least they know what happened to her. And you realize that murder doesn't just destroy the victim. It sends shockwaves through generations. Rita's nieces and nephews grew up with an aunt they never met, and a family tragedy that hung over every gathering. And even now, even with answers, that loss is still there. That hole in the family is still there. It's just that now they know why it's there. The Curran family does something beautiful at the press conference. They announce that they're creating a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for Season of Justice, a non-profit organization that provides grants to police departments to help cover the expensive costs of DNA testing and genetic genealogy. And Season of Justice had given Burlington police the money they needed to send the evidence to Parabon Nanolabs. And without that funding, without that private support, the case might have stayed cold because police departments have limited budgets, and DNA testing is expensive, and genetic genealogy costs even more. And sometimes cases don't get solved, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because there's no money to process it. The Burlington police set a goal of raising $7,000 to repay Season of Justice, so that money can be used to help solve other cold cases. And within 9 days, within just over a week, the campaign raises more than $7,300, exceeds its goal. And that outpouring of support shows you that people care about cold cases, care about justice, care about making sure that families get answers even decades after their loved ones were killed. The media coverage of the Rita Curran case is extensive. CNN covers it, NBC covers it, Fox News covers it, Vermont Public Radio covers it, newspapers across the country cover it, and the story resonates because it has everything. An innocent victim who was a teacher and singer, a brutal murder that shocked a community, a killer who fled to Thailand and became a monk, a wife who lied to protect her husband, DNA evidence from a cigarette butt, genetic genealogy that cracked the case wide open. and a family that waited 52 years for justice, and people are fascinated by this story. Fascinated by how you solve a murder after half a century. Fascinated by the technology, fascinated by the human drama, fascinated by the fact that William de Roos thought he got away with it. Thought he'd escaped to Thailand and reinvented himself as a Buddhist monk and moved to San Francisco and died without ever facing consequences. But he didn't get away with it, not really. Because his name is now forever associated with this crime, his legacy is that of a murderer. And history will remember him not as a monk or a guru, but as the man who killed Rita Curran. Some people ask whether it matters that de Roos is dead. Whether there's any point in solving a case when you can't arrest anyone. You can't put anyone on trial, can't send anyone to prison. And the answer is yes, it absolutely matters. It matters to Rita's family, who spent 5 decades wondering who killed their sister and daughter. It matters to the Burlington community, who lived with an unsolved murder hanging over them. It matters to the other women de Roos attacked, who now know their attacker was also a killer. It matters to the historical record, because every murder should be solved if possible. And it matters as a deterrent, because every cold case that gets solved sends a message to other killers that you're never really safe. That technology keeps advancing, that evidence keeps getting retested, that someone might crack your case 30 years, or 40 years, or 50 years after you thought you got away with it. The Rita Curran case also raises interesting questions about the nature of guilt and redemption and justice, because William de Roos didn't just kill Rita and run away. He went to Thailand and became a Buddhist monk. And Buddhism is all about compassion and non-violence and enlightenment. And you have to wonder what was going through his head. Was he trying to atone for what he did? Was he trying to escape his own guilt? Was he using the monastery as a hiding place? Was he genuinely trying to become a better person, or was he just running from the law? And we'll never know because he's dead, and he never confessed, and he never explained himself. But there's something deeply disturbing about the idea of a murderer putting on monk's robes, of a man who strangled a young woman claiming to follow a path of peace and enlightenment, of someone who committed such violence seeking refuge in a religion that teaches non-harm. When de Roos married his first wife, Michelle, they'd been married exactly 2 weeks when he killed Rita. And think about that timeline. Think about being a newlywed. Think about being in that honeymoon phase where everything is supposed to be perfect and wonderful. And then your husband goes out for a walk to cool down after an argument and comes back, and the next morning you find out someone was murdered downstairs, and your husband tells you to lie to the police. And what do you do in that moment? Do you believe him when he says he didn't do anything wrong? Do you trust the man you just married? Do you question whether he might be capable of murder? And Michelle chose to believe him, chose to lie for him, chose to protect him. And then she followed him to Thailand, where he'd become a monk. And you have to imagine she spent the rest of her life wondering, questioning, maybe knowing deep down, but not wanting to admit it. And when Detective Chanette interviewed her in 2022 and told her about the DNA evidence, maybe part of her was relieved to finally know the truth, to finally stop wondering, to finally be able to admit what she'd probably suspected for 50 years. The investigation also reveals that de Roos wasn't in Thailand for very long. He disrobed and left the monastery and eventually made his way back to the United States and ended up in San Francisco, where he reinvented himself again, this time as a guru named Dutch. And he married Sarah Hepting and proceeded to abuse her and attack her friends and generally be the same violent predator he'd always been. And this speaks to something important about criminal behavior, that people don't usually commit one violent crime and then never do it again, that murder is often part of a pattern, that someone who's capable of strangling a stranger in her apartment is probably capable of other violence. And if de Roos had lived longer, if he hadn't overdosed on morphine in that San Francisco hotel room in 1986, there's every reason to think he would have hurt more people, would have killed again, would have left more victims and more devastated families in his wake. The Burlington police put DeRuse's DNA into the national database after solving the case, and they're checking to see if his DNA matches any other unsolved crimes, any other murders or sexual assaults or attacks. Because it's entirely possible that Rita Curran wasn't his only victim. Entirely possible that there are other cases out there waiting to be connected to William DeRuse. Entirely possible that solving this one case will lead to solving others. The case also highlights the role of non-profit organizations like Season of Justice in solving cold cases. Because the reality is that most police departments don't have unlimited budgets for cold case investigations. They're dealing with current crimes, current emergencies, current public safety issues, and a 50-year-old murder, as tragic and important as it is, sometimes has to take a back seat to what's happening right now. And that's where organizations like Season of Justice come in, providing funding for DNA testing, providing resources for genetic genealogy, providing support that allows cold cases to move forward when they might otherwise stay frozen in time. C.C. Moore and Parabon Nanolabs deserve enormous credit for their work on this case and dozens of others like it. Because genetic genealogy is painstaking work, it requires genealogical research skills, requires understanding how to build family trees, requires patience and persistence and attention to detail, requires taking genetic matches and turning them into actual suspects. And Moore and her team have solved case after case after case that seemed impossible, have given closure to families who thought they'd never get answers, have proved that modern technology combined with old-fashioned genealogical research can crack even the coldest cases. The Curran family's decision to use their newfound closure to help other families is remarkable. The fact that they immediately thought about how to give back, how to help solve other cases, how to make sure Season of Justice has resources to help other police departments. That speaks to the kind of people they are, that speaks to Rita's legacy, that speaks to the idea that even in tragedy, even in murder, even in 5 decades of unanswered questions, there can be grace and generosity and a desire to help others who are suffering the same way you suffered. The Burlington Police Department's decision to use a team approach for the cold case, to treat it like an active investigation, even though it was 50 years old. That's a model for how cold case investigations should be handled. Because one detective working alone can only do so much, but a whole team bringing different perspectives, different expertise, different ideas. That's how you break through decades of dead ends and find the answer that's been hiding in plain sight. Let's talk about the science for a minute, because understanding how genetic genealogy actually works helps you appreciate just how revolutionary this technology is and why it's solving cold cases that would have been impossible to crack even 10 years ago. And genetic genealogy isn't magic. It's not some science fiction technology. It's basically just using the same consumer DNA services that millions of people use to find out their ancestry and family history. Except instead of finding your Irish great-grandmother or your cousin in Wisconsin, you're using it to find murderers and rapists who left their DNA at crime scenes decades ago. Here's how it works. When you submit DNA to a crime lab, they extract a genetic profile, a unique identifier based on specific markers in your DNA, and traditionally they would compare that profile to CODIS, the criminal DNA database, hoping to find an exact match, hoping that your suspect has been arrested before and had their DNA entered into the system. But CODIS only has DNA from convicted offenders and arrestees, maybe a few million profiles total, which sounds like a lot until you realize there are 330 million people in the United States, and the vast majority of them aren't in CODIS. Genetic genealogy takes a different approach. Instead of looking for exact matches, it looks for partial matches, for relatives, for anyone who shares enough DNA with your unknown suspect to indicate a family connection. And it does this by comparing your unknown DNA profile to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, where millions of people have voluntarily uploaded their DNA hoping to find relatives and learn about their ancestry. And most of these people have no idea their DNA might someday be used to solve a murder. Have no idea they might be the genetic link that leads police to their cousin or uncle or grandfather who committed a terrible crime decades ago. When C.C. Moore uploaded the cigarette butt DNA to these databases, the system found people who shared segments of DNA with the smoker. People who didn't match exactly, but matched enough to be second cousins or third cousins or some other degree of relation. And Moore then looked at these genetic matches and started building family trees, started researching genealogical records to figure out how these people are related to each other. Started working backward through generations to find common ancestors. And once you identify common ancestors, you can work forward through their descendants, through all the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and you can start narrowing down which branch of the family tree your suspect comes from. This process requires access to birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, census data, newspaper archives, military records, all the documentation that people leave behind as they live their lives. And it requires understanding how genetics work, understanding inheritance patterns, understanding how to interpret DNA matches and determine what they mean in terms of family relationships. And it's time-consuming and complex and requires real expertise, which is why genetic genealogists like C.C. Moore are in such high demand. In Rita Curran's case, Moore found matches that all pointed to the DeRoos family, found genetic connections on both the paternal side and the maternal side that converged on one surname, one lineage, and then she looked at which members of the DeRoos family were the right age, lived in the right place, had the right opportunity to be at that apartment building in July 1971, and there was really only one person who fit William DeRoos. And then, when they got the confirming DNA sample from his half-brother Douglas McGinty, they knew for certain that the cigarette smoker was from the DeRoos family, and given all the other evidence, given the proximity and the timing and the motive and the pattern of violence, it had to be William. The use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations is relatively new. It really exploded in 2018 when police used it to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, who committed at least 13 murders and 50 rapes in California in the 1970s and 80s and evaded capture for decades. And the Golden State Killer case proved that genetic genealogy could solve even the most difficult, most cold cases, and after that success, police departments across the country started using this technique, started sending their old DNA evidence to genetic genealogists, started solving cases that had been cold for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Since 2018, genetic genealogy has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases, and the numbers keep growing because the technology keeps improving. The databases keep getting bigger, and more police departments are learning how to use this tool. And we're living through this golden age of cold case solutions, where murders that seemed unsolvable are getting cracked open because of a cigarette butt or a hair or a drop of blood that was preserved decades ago when nobody knew it would ever be useful. But genetic genealogy also raises privacy concerns that are worth thinking about, because when you submit your DNA to a genealogy website, you're not just submitting your own genetic information, you're also submitting information about your relatives, about your cousins and aunts and uncles who never consented to have their DNA searched. And if one of your relatives committed a crime, your DNA submission might be what leads police to them. And some people are comfortable with that, think it's a good use of technology, think that solving murders is more important than privacy concerns, while other people worry about the implications, worry about government access to genetic data, worry about where this might lead, worry about false positives and misidentifications and the potential for abuse. The debate over genetic genealogy often breaks down along predictable lines. Law enforcement and victims' families love it because it solves cases and brings closure and identifies dangerous criminals, while civil libertarians and privacy advocates worry about it. Because it involves searching databases of people who never consented to be part of criminal investigations, and it sets precedents that could be expanded in troubling ways. And both sides have valid points. Both sides are arguing in good faith. And society is still figuring out where to draw the lines, how to balance the incredible crime-solving potential of this technology against legitimate privacy concerns. In Rita Curran's case, it's hard to argue that genetic genealogy was anything other than an unambiguous good. It identified a man who was already dead, a man who killed at least one woman and attacked others, a man who thought he escaped justice, and it brought closure to a family that had suffered for 52 years. And it did all this without violating anyone's rights, or falsely accusing anyone, or causing any harm beyond revealing an uncomfortable truth about a man who's been dead for 37 years. The Burlington police were careful about how they conducted the investigation. They didn't just rely on genetic genealogy alone. They confirmed it with DNA from DeRousse's half-brother. They re-interviewed his ex-wife. They tested additional evidence from the crime scene. They built a comprehensive case that would have held up in court if DeRousse had still been alive. And that thoroughness, that commitment to doing it right, that's what gives the genetic genealogy findings credibility and legitimacy. One of the most powerful aspects of the Rita Curran case is how it demonstrates that truth has a way of coming out eventually, that you can run to Thailand and become a monk. You can change your name to Dutch and present yourself as a guru. You can convince your wife to lie for you. You can die thinking you got away with murder. But 50 years later, a genetic genealogist in Virginia is going to upload your DNA to a database and figure out who you are, and your name is going to be announced at a press conference as a killer, and that's going to be your legacy forever. William DeRousse probably thought he was safe after a few years. Probably thought after a decade or two that no one was looking for him anymore. Probably thought when he died in 1986 that he'd taken his secret to the grave. And he did take it to the grave, in the sense that he never confessed, never admitted what he did, never faced any earthly consequences. But he didn't get away with it because history knows now. His family knows now, the world knows now. And his name will forever be associated with the brutal murder of Rita Curran. There's something deeply satisfying about that. Something that speaks to a basic human need for justice and truth. Something that says even if you escape prosecution, even if you die before you're caught, even if you think you won, you didn't win. Because the truth came out and your victims are remembered with sympathy and honor while you're remembered as a monster. Rita Curran's family has to live with the fact that Rita died violently at 24, that she never got to have a career or a family or a full life, that she never got to see her parents grow old or watch her siblings have children or experience any of the joys that should have been hers. But at least they know now. At least they can tell Rita's story with a beginning, middle, and end. At least they can say her name without that question mark hanging over it. The case also shows why it's so important to preserve evidence even when a case goes cold. Because you never know when technology is going to advance, when some new technique is going to emerge, when someone is going to figure out how to extract information from evidence that seemed useless at the time it was collected. And if those 1971 detectives had thrown away that cigarette butt, if they'd decided it wasn't worth keeping, if they'd lost it or destroyed it or failed to preserve it properly, this case would still be unsolved. Rita's family would still be wondering. William DeRousse would have truly gotten away with murder. Every piece of evidence in every unsolved case is a potential future solution. And police departments need to treat their evidence rooms like treasure vaults, need to maintain proper storage conditions, need to keep detailed records of what they have and where it came from, need to make sure that when genetic genealogy or whatever comes next, after genetic genealogy becomes available, they have evidence to test. The Burlington Police Department did that, maintained that evidence for 5 decades, and it paid off. And hopefully other departments are learning from this example, are looking at their own cold cases, are thinking about what evidence they have that could be retested with modern methods. Burlington, Vermont is a small city, about 45,000 people now, a little smaller back in 1971. And Rita Curran's murder was a huge deal there, was the kind of crime that makes people lock their doors and look over their shoulders and wonder if they're safe. And for 50 years, the people of Burlington lived with this unsolved murder, lived with the knowledge that someone had killed a young teacher in her apartment and gotten away with it, lived with the fear that maybe the killer was still out there, still in their community, still dangerous. And solving the case brings a kind of collective relief, a sense that justice was done even if it took half a century, a sense that their city's oldest and darkest mystery has finally been resolved. The press conference that announced the solution was held at Burlington Police Headquarters, and you can watch it online. You can see Acting Chief John Murad and Detective Lieutenant Jim Tribe and Detective Thomas Chenette explaining what they found. You can see Rita's brother and sister speaking about their family's ordeal. You can see C.C. Moore on video call explaining the genetic genealogy process. And the whole thing is emotional and professional and represents hundreds of hours of work by multiple people who cared about solving this case, who cared about giving Rita's family answers, who cared about justice even for a victim they never met, who died before many of them were born. The Rita Curran case is part of a larger wave of cold case solutions that we're seeing in the 2020s. Because genetic genealogy isn't just solving 1 or 2 cases, it's solving hundreds of them. It's cracking murders from the 1970s and 80s and 90s. It's identifying serial killers who've been dead for decades. It's bringing closure to families who've been waiting their whole lives for answers. And this wave represents a fundamental shift in how we investigate and solve crimes. Represents a moment where technology has finally caught up to our need for justice. In 2023 alone, dozens of cold cases were solved using genetic genealogy. Cases from all over the country, cases involving victims of all ages and backgrounds, cases that had been unsolved for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or more. And each one of these cases represents a family that finally got answers, a community that finally got closure, a killer who was finally identified even if they were already dead. The 5 cold cases highlighted in a Psychology Today article from December 2024 show the range and power of this technology. From the 1979 murder of 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez in California to the 1980 stabbing death of Mary Tracy in Idaho to the 1974 murder of hitchhiker Mary Schleis in Wisconsin, and in each case, genetic genealogy was the key that unlocked decades-old mysteries, was the tool that turned impossible cases into solved cases, was the bridge between past and present that allowed justice to finally be served. What makes the Rita Curran case particularly compelling is the character of William DeRoos, because he's not your typical murderer. He's not some violent criminal with a long rap sheet. He's a man who fled to Thailand and became a Buddhist monk, who reinvented himself as a spiritual guru, who presented himself as someone seeking peace and enlightenment. And that disconnect between his public persona and his private violence is disturbing and fascinating in equal measure. You have to wonder what motivated him to become a monk. Whether it was genuine spiritual seeking or guilt or fear, or just a convenient way to disappear. Whether he meditated on what he'd done to Rita Curran, whether he tried to atone, whether he experienced remorse, or whether he just compartmentalized it, locked it away, convinced himself it wasn't real or wasn't his fault or wasn't worth thinking about. Buddhism teaches nonviolence, teaches compassion for all living beings, teaches that killing is one of the gravest sins a person can commit. And yet William DeRoos, who strangled Rita Curran to death, put on monk's robes and lived in a monastery and presumably studied these teachings. And how do you reconcile that? How do you study compassion when you've killed someone? How do you meditate on nonviolence when you've committed the ultimate violence? And maybe DeRoos was a hypocrite. Maybe he was using the monastery as a hiding place. Or maybe on some level he was genuinely trying to change, trying to become a better person, trying to escape his own violent impulses. And he failed because by the time he got to San Francisco, he was attacking women again, was stabbing his wife's friend, was strangling his wife, was proving that whatever spiritual transformation he claimed to have experienced in Thailand was either incomplete or fraudulent. The question of whether DeRoos had other victims is haunting because his pattern of violence against women, his unprovoked attacks, his use of strangulation, his ability to blend into different communities and present different personas, all of that suggests someone who could have been a serial offender. Someone who might have hurt or killed other women over the 15 years between Rita's murder and his own death. The Burlington police are looking into this, are checking his DNA against other unsolved cases, are trying to see if there are connections to crimes in Thailand or San Francisco or anywhere else DeRoos lived. And it's possible they'll find something. Possible that Rita wasn't his only victim. Possible that solving her case will lead to solving others. The fact that DeRoos died in 1986 means we'll never know for certain what else he might have done. Can never interview him, can never get a confession, can never understand what was going through his mind when he attacked Rita or when he fled to Thailand or when he reinvented himself as Dutch the Guru. And that lack of closure, that inability to ask the perpetrator why and how and what were you thinking, that's one of the frustrating aspects of cold case investigations where the suspect is already dead. But in another sense, the fact that DeRoos is dead makes the investigation simpler because you don't have to worry about violating his rights. Don't have to worry about defense attorneys challenging your methods. Don't have to worry about proving beyond a reasonable doubt. You just have to establish the truth, and the truth is clear. William DeRoos killed Rita Curran. The DNA proves it. His ex-wife's testimony confirms it. His pattern of violence against women supports it. And the case is closed. The role of Michelle DeRoos, or Kailas Nagarjuna, as she's now known, is complicated because on one hand, she lied to police and provided a false alibi that protected a murderer for 5 decades. But on the other hand, she was a 23-year-old newlywed who trusted her husband and believed his lies and probably didn't want to think that the man she'd just married could be capable of such brutality. Detective Chanette's decision not to recommend charges against her is the right one, because what purpose would it serve? She's an old woman now. She's cooperated fully with the investigation. She's told the truth after 50 years of living with that lie. And prosecuting her wouldn't bring Rita back, wouldn't undo the damage, wouldn't serve any purpose except revenge. And revenge isn't justice. Kailas has to live with the knowledge that she lied for a murderer, that her false alibi gave DeRoos the cover he needed to flee to Thailand and escape justice. That if she'd told the truth in 1971, maybe DeRoos would have been arrested and convicted, and Rita's family would have gotten answers decades earlier. And that's a heavy burden to carry. That's something she'll think about every day for the rest of her life, and maybe that's punishment enough. The fact that Kailas eventually became a Buddhist nun herself is an interesting footnote. Suggests that she was influenced by DeRoos's spiritual journey. Suggests that maybe she was searching for peace and understanding and redemption in the same way he claimed to be. And you wonder if she ever talked to him about Rita's murder after the fact. If she ever confronted him, if he ever admitted what he did. Or if they just never spoke of it, never acknowledged it, let it sit between them like a ghost. The impact of Rita Curran's murder extends far beyond her immediate family, extends to the teaching profession, because Rita was a second-grade teacher, and teachers form bonds with their students and colleagues, extends to the Milton Elementary School, where she taught, and where people remembered her decades later, extends to the barbershop quartet community where she sang and where people treasured her voice. extends to the entire Burlington community that lived with this unsolved murder for 5 decades. When a young woman is killed in her apartment for no reason, when she's just trying to live her life and pursue her career, and suddenly she's dead because someone decided to hurt her. That creates ripples that spread out in all directions, that affect people who never met her, but who hear her story and think that could have been me, that could have been my sister, that could have been my daughter. Rita's case became one of those murders that people talk about, that gets mentioned when people discuss Burlington history, that becomes part of the collective memory of a community, and solving it after 52 years brings a kind of communal closure, allows people to finally close that chapter, allows Burlington to say, we never forgot, we never gave up, we kept working, and we finally got the answer. The press conference, where the Burlington police announced the solution, was widely covered by local media, and you could see on people's faces that this mattered to them, that they'd been following this case for years or decades, that they cared about Rita, even though most of them never knew her. And that's what makes cold case work so important. It's not just about the immediate family, it's about showing that society cares, that murder isn't forgotten just because time passes, that victims matter regardless of how long ago they died. Season of Justice, the non-profit that funded the DNA testing in Rita's case, represents a model for how cold cases can be solved when police departments lack the resources to do it themselves. Because the reality is that DNA testing is expensive, genetic genealogy is even more expensive, and most police departments are operating on tight budgets where every dollar has to be justified and prioritized. And a 50-year-old murder, as tragic as it is, sometimes has to compete with current cases, current emergencies, current needs. And that's where non-profit funding becomes crucial. The Curran family's decision to raise money to repay Season of Justice so that funding can be used for other cases is exactly the right approach. Creates a virtuous cycle where solving one case leads to funding that helps solve another case. And if every family whose cold case gets solved did the same thing, donated to help other families, the impact would be enormous. There are thousands of unsolved murders in the United States, thousands of families waiting for answers, thousands of cases sitting in evidence rooms with DNA that could potentially be tested. And the limiting factor isn't usually the technology or the expertise, it's the money. It's the funding to pay for the testing and the genealogical research. And organizations like Season of Justice help bridge that gap, help make sure that lack of funding isn't the reason a case stays cold. C.C. Moore and Parabon Nanolabs deserve recognition for their work not just on this case, but on dozens of others. Because Moore has become the face of genetic genealogy, has appeared on countless news programs explaining how the technology works, has testified in court, has trained law enforcement officers, has built family trees for case after case after case, and her work has brought closure to families across the country who thought they'd never get answers. The speed with which Moore identified William DeRoos just a few hours after uploading the DNA profile demonstrates how powerful this technology can be when it's in expert hands. When someone who really knows what they're doing applies these tools to a case. Not every case is that fast. Not every case has such clear genetic matches, but the fact that it's possible, the fact that a murder from 1971 can be solved in a matter of hours using DNA from a cigarette butt, that's revolutionary, that changes everything about how we think about cold cases and what's solvable and what's not. The future of cold case investigation is clearly going to involve more genetic genealogy, more DNA testing, more use of technology that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. And we're going to see more and more of these decades-old cases getting solved, more and more families getting closure, more and more killers being identified even if they're already dead. And that's a good thing. That's justice being served, even if it's delayed justice, even if it comes too late for the victims. But at least it comes. The Rita Curran case teaches us several important lessons about murder investigation and justice and truth. It teaches us that evidence should always be preserved, because you never know when technology will advance. It teaches us that genetic genealogy is an incredibly powerful tool that can solve cases that seemed impossible. It teaches us that police departments need to dedicate resources to cold cases, even when it's difficult and expensive. It teaches us that non-profit organizations can play a crucial role in funding the work that needs to be done. It teaches us that patterns of violence often predict future violence. It teaches us that someone who hurts one woman has probably hurt others. It teaches us that you can run to the other side of the world and change your name and reinvent yourself, but the truth has a way of coming out eventually. And it teaches us that families never stop caring, never stop hoping, never stop wanting answers no matter how many decades pass. Rita Curran was 24 years old when she died. She was a teacher and a singer and a daughter and a sister and a friend. She had her whole life ahead of her. She'd just moved into her first apartment. She was pursuing her education and her career. She was doing everything right. And she was killed by her neighbor for no reason. Killed by a man who then fled the country and pretended to be a monk and died without ever facing justice. And for 52 years, her family wondered and waited and hoped and prayed that someday they'd know what happened. And finally, in 2023, they got their answer. Finally, the Burlington police could tell them, "We know who killed Rita. We know what happened that night. We've closed the case." And that answer, that closure, that's not nothing, that's everything. That's what Rita's family had been waiting for since 1971. And now they have it, and they can tell Rita's story with a beginning and middle and end, can honor her memory with the full truth, can make sure that when people remember Rita Curran, they don't just remember the victim of an unsolved murder. They remember a young woman whose case was solved through brilliant detective work and cutting-edge technology and the determination of people who refused to give up, who kept fighting for justice even when it seemed impossible, who proved that murder cases are never truly cold, as long as someone cares enough to keep working them. And the Burlington police cared, and Rita's family cared, and Season of Justice cared, and Cece Moore cared. And now William DeRousse's name is forever linked to this crime, and Rita Curran's name is linked to one of the most successful cold case investigations in Vermont history. And that's how it should be. That's justice, that's truth. That's the power of modern detective work combined with technology that the 1971 investigators could never have imagined, but that they made possible by preserving that cigarette. But by collecting that evidence, by doing their jobs with such thoroughness and professionalism that 52 years later, their work could finally bear fruit, and finally solve Vermont's oldest cold case, and finally give Rita Curran the justice she deserved. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.